Give it to her. Tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon. Now, obviously, I've already been introduced, but it's my pleasure to welcome you to this live session. Wool's Next Wave, Innovation, Performance and Value. As New Zealand looks to breathe new life into its wool sector, the fusion of science, sustainability and innovation is creating exciting opportunities. Wool, once seen largely as a traditional commodity, is being reimagined as a high-performance fiber with application across advanced textiles, bioplastics, and the circular economy. Today's session will explore the cutting-edge science that's expanding the potential of wool and unlocking new value for our fiber sector. It's about strengthening performance, enhancing sustainability, and opening fresh markets for this iconic natural resource. To begin, I'm pleased to introduce Professor John Pitfrey, who will provide an overview of Lincoln University's work in this space. John is a geneticist whose research focuses on sheep and cattle, particularly the genes that influence meat, milk, and wool production, as well as disease and environmental resilience. His team is at the forefront of genetic testing that supports both industry and breeders, and he's passionate about making his science accessible to farmers and the next generation. Please join me in welcoming John to the stage.
Thanks, Richard. Great welcome. So I'll just do I advance this one? I chose this title because I thought about those of us here at Lincoln that actually teach in wool science. We're both young, our average age, and it's just over 30, because the other one's David Scobie in the audience today. So we're alive and kicking, I think, at last count. But I thought I'd just go through quickly through 4 recent activities that I've been involved in at Lincoln, which shows you a little bit of profile of what is happening here. I'm going to cover teaching first. This year, Scobie's taken over teaching the 3rd year class from me, so I'm partially retired from Lincoln. Chester's going to give me a pay rise, he said, but partially retired from Lincoln, which does not mean that I'm a person with spare time in his hands, because I've got other interests as well. So where do I start? Well, innovation and teaching. Teaching is our primary source of income at a university. You've got to focus on that. This is our bread and butter. It is our reliable income. Everything else is nice to have some icing. So until the year before, 2 years ago, I was teaching 3rd year ag class about wool. And it was a small block of lectures, but it was a lot of fun. And so I set this assignment for 3rd year class of, quote, bold this, from a scientific point of view. I didn't want politics. Write a letter to the Secretary of Education, that was Dr. Iona Halstead, explaining why wool would be better, or not, than synthetic for carpet in schools. You probably remember the dialogue that was occurring at the time. We got put in the schools that rural communities have been absolutely feral at times. Broke up there, good on too. I didn't get a single essay that was against the use of wool carpet. I did have to weed some back and say, guys, this is politics, this is not science. Politics is easy, but the letters on the whole, brilliant. Okay. So then once they'd handed things, I said to the students, well, you've got the option. You can actually send these things off to the Ministry of Education, to Iona. We have all the details, they're public servants. But copy them to the Minister, who at that stage was Jan Tonetti as well. And most students sent their letters off. There's a little bit about Lincoln students too. They are, dare I say, they're actually politicians. Sometimes they've paraded scientists, but they're probably more politicians than scientists. I don't think we were popular in Wellington at all, in the very least with the last government. But it seemed to spread like wildfire through the rural community in New Zealand that we were in there back in the day. And of course, what you've seen recently is that the government now has said that Kainara must put wool into their houses. This housing stock's huge. We have a lot of state houses in New Zealand. What was the upshot of this? I was rung by Jamie Mackay, who's one of my contemporaries here from the early 80s at Lincoln, who said, I see you're doing God's work. After you'd been shot in the kneecaps or whatever from that one there. Thanks, Jamie. He's not here. I did actually find a biblical quote about God's work, and this is really quite appropriate. And Gideon said unto God, think of this in terms of Gaza, where we're at the moment, world peace. If thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the floor. It is a direct from Judges 6:36. What I didn't know was the book. judges, I'm not religious, but I thought that was poetic in profiling current history, current politics and history too. It goes back a bit. I can forgive Jamie. I cannot forgive a student who said, this was the best assignment I've ever done at Lincoln. I thought, oh, we're letting them down a bit, aren't we? But he loved it, and he was actually a very strong advocate, went out there and did it. But a lot of them came back and really rated on teaching evaluations. Then the project they really buy into politically works. So that's innovation and teaching. I've passed the baton over to Scobie. We still bounce ideas around quite regularly, so think about that. I'm currently involved in industry skills development. So the wool's got to come through. It's got to come from sheep. So I'm working with an organisation that I doubt many of you have heard about, called Makatangara, which is a workforce development council, a government agency involved in developing people in the food and fibre industries. So we're working again on Friday at the idea of developing a level 5 qualification, which will be a certificate in wool technology is the title we're currently sitting with. Now, that actually goes back to history, to what we had. It's a fairly generic title, but it emphasises the fact it's not just science, it's technology as well. It's quite intensive, and we've got people from all over the industry. I won't mention names, but just about every part of the industry, from farmers upwards to the high-end fashion, is represented in the working group there. And it's been a very positive experience so far. It's early days yet, but there's a lot of interest in getting this qualification back at Lincoln, because a lot of the ones there say this is the natural home. That's very positive. It will make money. And it does need to have both practical skills, so hands-on stuff. We've got to have that. That's actually a whole lot of qualifications anyway, but also academic content that allows our young people, and some of them won't be so young, going through that qualification to project forward in terms of how we might actually improve wool in the future. So that's something that I'm working on, separate to my employment at Lincoln, but intrinsically tied into Lincoln, because I do see Lincoln as a natural home for wool. Not where it's been in the past. I still do a lot of research. This is my job at Lincoln. So I've been doing that since 1992. We've been having children in Michael, I think. Yeah. And I've published over 100 papers just on wool. I've published many more on, Chad covered some of the other things that I'm interested in, but over 100 papers there. We focus on keratin and the keratin-associated proteins. And specifically, I focus on the genes that underpin those proteins, because those genes are highly variable. They're probably one of the biggest gene families known is the keratins. It's over keratin association proteins, for example, at least 102. We just published a paper yesterday, came out, where we found another 3. It's frightening just how much is there. But we're interested in how variation in them affects wool fibre traits, because one of my real concerns, one of the things that confounds wool, is it's a highly variable fibre. Even on a single sheep, there's a huge amount of variation. And manufacturers of woolen product typically don't like variation in fibre. We've got to compete with natural fibres and synthetic fibres that are far more consistent, and wool has trouble because of their variability. So we've got to improve on that. As I said, here, variation in wool fibres is a key problem that limits the ability to compete with other natural and synthetic fibres. One of my out-of-Lincoln jobs now is working with industry, and I won't say who those are, because there are people involved in various agreements, to produce new products. Okay. So 2 photos will be presented. At the top there, this is a fine merino. At the bottom, the white fibre is a fine merino 2-ply yarn spun. That wool's probably sitting around 18 to 19 micron. We know about it. And you can see it, it's a beautiful fibre. It's not very strong at all. It's the people we're working with know that their fibre's letting them down. Above it there, that's actually Romney wool. And I'm working with some breeders that are very interested in getting their Romneys finer, but also improving the consistency of the fibre. So that's working with breeders and people that are spinning and so on to try and get the fibre. You can see it doesn't compare currently. It's probably twice the size. It's a single ply of the merino, but we're pushing down that way. And that's good. We can do more with our crossbred wool, which is where the low prices are typically found at the moment. So that's the first thing. Second photo here, and Rob Hewitt's here, so I'm going to thank Rob for this, because this is wool that came from Woolworks, is we've been working with wool boards. Got to be very careful with the wording I use here. There's a lot of politics around dry wool panelling. And this is dry wool panelling made with wool fibres, okay, as opposed to fiberglass. So the current market product, you can whisper amongst yourselves what that is, a market-leading product, is full of fiberglass fibres. it can't be recycled. So it's dumped, and my son's a builder. He's just criminal how much is just thrown out. They cut off a corner, they use it on the wall. It's not worth them even repurposing what's left. It just gets dumped. And when they're doing a house fit, the designers now trying to limit the amount of cuts and diagonals and so on, but it's a huge amount of wastage. Half our dumped material is building waste in New Zealand. That's wool. We've tested it out. I love destructive testing. That's the fun part of the job. It's much, much stronger than the competing leading product. That's good news. Bad news is the competing product is part of a suite of similar products that seem to be tied up and closely linked to large international organisations that are founded in Saudi Arabia and the United States of America. So when you go and talk to the people manufacturing the current product, you tend to hit a brick wall of difference and a very narrow mindset in terms of what you might want to do with the product. That with gypsum and card and wool would be fully biodegradable. So we're having other conversations outside of that. I can't mention the people we're just talking to. I can't mention the people that are having those conversations. But yeah, Woolworks Fibre, thanks. And there's some keys to getting it down to the level where it actually makes a stronger board. If you take the competing product, you bend it, breaks, shatters, it's stuffed. This thing seems to have greater strength than that thing, but it also seems to be more debt resistant too, which, you know, if you've had young kids, you know that's a challenge. So that's the research we're doing and development, I suppose, technology. And finally, acknowledgements. I do work with the industry. So I was recently made an honorary member of the Wool Classers Association. Don't get me wrong, I have no skills in wool classing. Stress that point. But that's Tracy Patterson there, who some of you might know Tracy. She's certainly a leader in the mid-micron range. She would say fine wool, but they're some of our top wool producers, the Pattersons. Otago, and it does improve it. And sorry about the overlap here, but recognize my effort to improve strong wool. A fine wool and a medium was okay. A strong wool here is typically now of far worse quality than it used to be. We've given up on wool. Inconsistency there, huge number of faults in the average bale now going through the likes of PGG rights, and there is some from the company here, but we see weakness in their wool going through sales. No wonder it's low price. So I'm looking at how we can improve on-farm practices to get better wool in the bale, specifically, because the point I keep making is that once the wool goes into the wool press at shearing, that's it. You can't do anything more easily to improve it. No one goes through and unpicks bales fleece by fleece to realise the value proposition. So you've got to get it right before it ever goes into the wool press if you want high quality, strong wool. And I know strong wool producers that are getting prices comparable to what merino producers are getting because they produce consistently fine and high quality fibre. Why is the market failing at the moment? Simple economics. It's a big parting message here. At the moment, demand, supply, we're oversupplied, there's no demand for it. If you want to improve demand, one of the things you can do easily is improve. Might not increase sales, but you might increase the value proposition. So I'll leave it there for slides. Are we going to have questions at the end? Yeah. So I'll pass straight to Stewart. You can do it.
Thank you. Join me in thanking John for it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Stewart Collie is the science team leader for Bioproduct and Fibre Technology at the Division of AgResearch in the Bioeconomy Science Institute. That's basically right. Thank you. Stewart is a leading textiles and materials scientist with over 25 years experience in wool and fiber innovation. He leads the team developing new materials from agricultural sources at the Bioeconomy Science Institute, where their research spans bioplastics, technical textiles, and biodegradable products. Today, Stewart will share how science and technology are transforming the way we think about wool, revealing breakthroughs in fiber durability, human textile interaction, and sustainability. His work is helping to reposition wool as a performance material for the future, with the potential to play a key role in New Zealand's low-carbon circular bioeconomy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stewart Collie. There is this. You want to be over there.
That's all right. That's fine. Thank you for that. There's one problem with providing the bio before you work out what your presentation is going to be, and that's that it may not match perfectly with the description, but I'll try to cover off most of those points. Two other excuses I'm going to make before I start. One is that I'm very definitely in the post-farm gate space as far as my research is concerned. So if you have questions or comments that relate to things that happen on the farm, then there are others here who are much more able to respond to those than me, and I'll direct questions in that direction if necessary. The other thing I will say is that in this presentation, so cool. Okay, I'll give it closer to you as well. So the other thing I was going to say is I'll provide some examples during my presentation of things that others are doing, very much different, not just stuff that we're thinking about. And there are people in the room here involved in those projects, and I apologize in advance to them if I don't represent that as well as they might like. I'll try to do them justice. I also apologize to others in this room who are doing really exciting things involved that don't get a mention in the presentation as well. So I'd definitely like to extend any kind of the enthusiasm that I'm trying to express to everybody in the space that's doing interesting things with the ball. So I shall get on. So I thought it's always good to start with the raw material. And this is a nice illustration of what the wool fibre looks like. You can see the different components of the fibre that make it up. It has this very complex structure. I'm not going to describe it in detail, but the message I want to get across is that it's made up of a bunch of different components arranged in a way that has delivered a high level of functionality to the fibre. And you can see some of those components in the illustration on the top right-hand side, which is an example of what happens when wool biodegrades. You can see those components of the fibre start to fall apart. So you've got cortical cells, you've got pieces of cuticle. So you've got this complex structure, and alongside the structure, you've also got a complex composition, keratin protein that the fibre is primarily made of, gives it a diversity of chemical functionality. One of the really important parts of that is the sulfur component that's in there. It provides sulfur crosslinks within the material, which is one way in which the fibre becomes robust and durable in the applications that we put it into. So my message here is that we have a sophisticated material, both in terms of its structure and composition. And for those of you that are long in the wool game, you will know a lot of these attributes well. These are the sorts of things that are exploited in the traditional products. It has attributes that relate to protection, so flame resistance, good insulation from crimp that's developed in the fibre, an ability to absorb UV. We think of this sometimes as a weakness in wool textiles because it's susceptible to degradation from UV, but if you think of that in the context of a wool garment, then that UV absorption that the wool fibre is doing is protecting you from UV exposure. And we know that in certain applications, it can absorb volatiles that might be indoor air pollutants and improve indoor air quality as a result. Then there's a lot of overlap between some of these areas, but if we look at things that are more related to health and well-being, then we've got this ability to absorb large amounts of moisture. And we've always said that wool can hold up to 1/3 of its weight in moisture and still feel dry. And that helps it deliver a thermophysiological comfort, which is moisture and heat management primarily. And that can translate through to a range of different applications, not just, say, sports performance, but also things like sleep quality. And research has shown improved quality of sleep for when wool bed clothing and bedwear is used. And even getting through to quite specific benefits, research quite recently has illustrated that fine merino wool next to the skin will actually improve eczema symptoms in people who suffer from that condition. So, and again, this is probably related to things like moisture management and that sophistication of the wool material, as well as its biocompatibility or similarity to human hair and even skin. So then looking at sustainability attributes of wool, we know that it's biodegradable. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, obviously, it's a natural material, it's biodegradable. It's worth remembering that it's highly recyclable as well. We don't need to wait for the end of its life and burial to get more value from wool. There's been a long history of recycling and reprocessing of wool fiber, and that still exists. It used to be a huge industry. A major part of wool processing was the reprocessing of wool textiles into new products. And then I've thrown biocompatibility in here, although that potentially relates to health and well-being. And I've put resists odor buildup into sustainability as well, for reasons which I'll describe a bit later on. But despite us all knowing these things, there are some issues or concerns that consumers might have and that competitor fibers would seek to exploit in promoting their product over wool. The environmental footprint associated with wool is dominated by the on-farm component of production, just by virtue of it being produced by sheep from ruminant animals. Animal welfare concerns obviously come up from time to time, and they've been prominent again recently. People often also have the perception that wool products might not be robust, they might not be durable, they're hard to look after, they might be delicate, you might need to hand wash it or put it on the delicate cycle. These things are not strictly accurate, but these are often things that the perceptions that we might have to overcome. And also that they might not perform well, that you might choose not to have wool active sportswear because you think it's going to get wet and heavy and uncomfortable. And maybe consumers will just think that wool is old-fashioned and uncool, which is a challenge that's being well addressed by brands and marketers in this space, and certainly not one topic that I can easily address. But it feels like there's a renaissance for wool at the moment, despite the circumstances that we find ourselves in terms of returns to growers. And it's interesting to think about where that's come from. And it feels like there's a renaissance now, but it is not something that has happened in the last year. A lot of the reasons I think that, and the examples that I provide, relate to activities that have been going on for 10, 15, 20 years, and it's taken that long for them to come to commercialization and for other circumstances to catch up with that. And one of the important drivers, I think, for a renaissance for wool is a resistance to plastic materials and a drive towards natural materials. And this is primarily coming at the moment from a concern about microplastic pollution and natural materials like wool not being a part of that problem. And it's really important that there are people who are championing wool, and they always have, but it feels like there's a prominence for them now, for organizations like Campaign for Wool and companies. And I've just given a couple of examples here. As I said at the beginning, there are many more people who are championing wool in New Zealand at the moment. But these are people who are determined to do something practical, to make a difference with wool. And often they come in, I think, to the industry, perhaps without being constrained by what might have happened in the past and without sort of a negative perception that might have accumulated over time. John touched on the fact that there's, if you like, political support for wool and new procurement rules around encouraging use of wool in public buildings. That's not just a benefit for wool growers, but it's a benefit for people that will be in those buildings, for people that have homes that have wool carpets or other wool textiles in them. And then I guess what I'm going to talk about the most are new applications and advanced materials based on wool. And this is an example, I think, of where there's been an enormous amount of work happening, perhaps behind the scenes in that research space, which is coming to fruition now, and I'll talk more about these on later slides. It's really interesting. I put my slide in saying Renaissance for wool a couple of days ago, and then this morning I spotted this post from Wise Wolf, saying exactly the same thing. So maybe there is a renaissance for wool at the moment. People are feeling it out there. And I like the fact that it's also saying that strong wool isn't just for carpets, because I'm not going to be talking about carpets. Not that I have anything against wool carpets, but there's more to it than that these days. So what is going on? I'm going to give some examples of new technologies, commercial activities that are going on that relate to wool, some of which you'll probably know about, but others maybe not. And the first ones that I illustrate are things where it's new uses for the wool as in its fiber form, because I'm going to talk about things where we're pulling the fiber apart and doing different things. And I wanted, even though I'm mostly talking about strong wool here, I wanted to highlight this company, Wool Aid, who are making wound dressings, adhesive plasters from merino wool. Part of the reason I like to include this one is because the illustration of the biodegradation happening there is something from a trial that we ran for them. So take a small bit of credit there. And it's important that it's exploiting that biodegradability, something that's a single-use product, obviously, but also biocompatibility in that wound care application area. So these guys are definitely worth watching. They're doing some really interesting things, and it's been great that we've had a little bit to do with them on the journey so far at AgResearch. I thought it was interesting to highlight this one as well. So this is acoustic materials from flock. And the interesting thing, or the appealing thing to me about acoustic panels made from wool, is that it's extending that benefit in the interior space that comes from wool carpets and those traditional wool products that end up in interiors, and getting much more wool into the environment, getting wool up onto the walls and onto the ceiling. You know, we can get to a point where we might surround ourselves in the built environment with wool. But all of the benefits that you might get from wool carpets in terms of moisture regulation in the built environment, absorption of indoor air volatiles and indoor air quality, can be expanded by getting into this type of application. And this might not be, on the face of it, technically very challenging as a product, but there's an awful lot of hard work and technical underpinning to make a product like this that meets the performance requirements for that application, and also the other regulations that are required for any product that ends up in the built environment as well. So even though it seems like it's relatively straightforward, there's a lot of technical know-how that's gone into doing that. And I mentioned, or I showed Woolchemy briefly on a previous slide as well. This is another example of taking the wool fiber, modifying it, making some changes to it, and enhancing its natural attributes, and then exploiting those. And in this case, it's wool for hygiene applications. And you're interested there in having high absorbency, so that's an attribute that the fiber can bring anyway, but also things like biocompatibility against the skin, odor resistance, and that type of thing. And then I also wanted to mention Lanaco, who's a company that makes high-performance filters from wool. And they make filters that are used as grease traps for kitchen environments, and that exploits one attribute of wool, the surface of the wool fiber that can absorb grease material and securely hold that. But a lot of their focus is around high-performance air filtration, high efficiency, effective particulate removal, and easy breathability as well. And those are exploiting attributes of the wool fiber that have not necessarily been a part of wool's story in the conventional products for it. So the next thing that you could do with wool fiber is pull it apart and use the components. And there's been lots of work from people involved in this area, from people in this room. So I'm not going into detail about any of the science here. But WoolSource is commercializing products that have been developed over a number of years around deconstruction of wool into functional materials, particles, pigments, and powders. And in these products, it's amplifying the natural attributes of wool. You're accessing more of the fiber essentially by pulling it apart. So, and it's taking advantage of those components that the wool fiber has. that you can pull it apart into. I can talk a bit more about things that we've been doing at AgResearch, which is another step along, again, putting the keratin back together, pulling the fiber apart and then putting it back together again, this time focused on the keratin protein within it. And the first example I want to talk about there is additive manufacturing from wool keratin. And the illustration on the bottom left there is intended to show a progression, a development of skill and technical capability from the outside in. We always liked the idea that you might 3D print a sheep from wool keratin. And that's what's been done there, starting from the rather crude, no offense to people in the room, through to the more refined. And you might think, why do you want to 3D print keratin and make these sorts of things? Well, it's not necessarily to make toy sheep. It's probably more around things that you could do in the biomedical space with medical materials, exploiting the biocompatibility of keratin in implants, tissue scaffolds, that type of thing, where having an ability to produce something that's bespoke to an individual is really valuable and important. And then bioplastics from keratin. Having said that it's difficult to 3D print keratin, one of the reasons for that is that keratin is not a thermoplastic polymer. The bioplastics demonstrate how you can, under the right conditions, make it behave somewhat like a thermoplastic polymer. You can get some flow behavior from the material and actually put it through thermoforming processes like compression molding and injection molding. And the illustration on the top right shows some discs that are actually made of injection molded keratin. So this has the potential to open up new types of material formats for wool and keratin. And then at the bottom, it's just showing how you can make these materials conform into interesting three-dimensional shapes by manipulating while they are warm and pliable, and then allowing them to cool. So a new space for wool. But you might be thinking to yourself, if we're going to do that type of break it down completely, why do we need to use wool? We don't have it in fiber form anymore. So why bother going to the trouble of getting lovely wool fibers that could be used for something else and using them in this type of application? Well, if you're just looking at the deconstruction side of things, then you can preserve those structural components and get some benefit from that. But the other nice thing about wool is that it's not a waste product. Most other keratin sources are waste. Some people might claim that wool is a waste product, there's a co-product of meat production, but we'll resist that. And that's important to some people for a number of reasons. It might be important simply because they don't like the idea of using a material that's a byproduct of meat production. Chickens and cows and the like have to die for us to get their keratin, usually. Sheep don't have to, sometimes they do, but wool is accessible to us without harming the animal. And the other thing I think that's worth keeping in mind is that John talked about the variability inherent in wool, but compared to a waste stream, it's pretty well specified and reliable as a material that you might obtain. So if you're looking to set up a manufacturing industry based on keratin, then wool is a good option because you've got an established supply chain where there's good level of specification provided about the materials that you might use, which is not always going to be the case for a waste material. So despite the fact that we might grumble about wool supply chains and their inefficiencies and all of that, they do at least provide a structure that means that if you're looking to make an advanced material where the specification of the raw material is really important, you've at least got that in place already. And we see that with some of those examples that I've talked about already, that the source of the fiber is something that matters a lot to them. It's worth talking about the environmental sustainability credentials of wool as well. We've got that challenge to manage around the production side of fiber from an environmental perspective. what that means is that we need to look more closely at the other attributes that the fiber has and how they influence other phases of a wool product's lifetime. And what's illustrated on this slide is work that focuses on the use phase of a wool product. And there are various reasons why wool has a lower impact during that phase of the product lifespan. What's illustrated here is the energy footprint associated with the year's use of these three different product types: socks, t-shirt, and a mid-layer sweater, made from three different fiber types. And your green bars are the wool, and the orange bars are the synthetic or polyester. And we can see that once you work through a calculation taking into account things like laundering frequency and laundering conditions, wool has a far lower impact than synthetic, and even lower than cotton as well. And one of the reasons for this is that reduction in odor development that I talked about earlier on, which leads to a reduced washing frequency for wool garments. And this was something that we established scientifically, as you can see on the left-hand side. Willing volunteers were more than happy to smell garments and decide whether they could be washed again or not. I hasten to add they were always smelling their own garments, not anybody else's. So it's important to look at the full picture when we're looking at the environmental credentials, and there's information to be gathered here and fed into a more comprehensive life cycle assessment for the fiber. And then it's important also to make sure that we have our house in order about end of life as well. We all know that wool is biodegradable, so surely there's no issue at end of life. But the important thing to remember is that commercial wool products aren't just wool, they have other components included in them. Even when I'm just talking about the wool component, it might be modified in some way to change or improve its performance. And the focus here is on machine washable wool, which is modified, it's surface modification to the fiber, chemical modification to the fiber, and then actually has a resin applied to it as well, a very small amount thereof. And the argument might be made that that's likely to be potential retard biodegradation or even generate microplastic pollution from it. So in this study, looking across the lines there, if you look at machine washable wool and compare it to untreated wool, the level of biodegradation is actually higher for the machine washable wool. So it's not less biodegradable, but more so. And there's good reasons for that, which I won't go into. And certainly not hindered in any way in these two environments. This is a marine biodegradation and an industrial composting environment, which hadn't been looked at before as well. But perhaps most importantly, down the bottom there, no microplastic residues detected. When the wool fiber breaks down, you can see you get lots of fragments of materials. It doesn't all go magically from intact fiber to nothing, or to elements. So part of this study was to look at the fragments that are generated and understand whether, for the machine washable wool, whether any of them could be that resin material, or if it too was potentially biodegradable. And all of the components that were examined were wool. So it would seem that there was certainly no obvious concern around what was happening to that modification, that resin that was being applied. And in fact, some evidence to suggest that it's biodegradable as well. So again, it's broadening the picture out and showing where the science can contribute to improving that overall story and making sure that we've got everything in place. So looking forward a bit more, I thought it'd be interesting to think about areas where there could be more research that would help support this renaissance for wool. And there's definitely more to do in the health and well-being space, with the concern around microplastics and the potential impact on health and well-being. We'd be interested in undertaking work that looks at the built environment and the nature of microplastics that are present there in houses that have wool carpets versus synthetic. And then also how, in the same way that the biodegradation work has been done, looking at how what impact they might have in the human physiological system, the extent to which humans might manage particles from wool compared to synthetics. And of course, our hypothesis would be that because we grow hair and we interact with biological materials that have keratin in them all the time, that the body is adapted to manage small quantities of those that it might inhale or ingest. But sometimes you need the data to be able to prove that when there are people that are looking to undermine wool. As far as new materials are concerned, a really important aspect of what we do in that space is to reflect on the fact that we are really quite inferior compared to nature in terms of making materials. We can't reconstitute keratin anything like as well as nature made the wool fiber in the first place. So there's things that we can learn and things that we will learn from the way that nature produces these materials around things like the self-assembly behavior of the protein and that type of thing. And an area that I'm interested in, which is kind of extension of the physiological work, that the benefits that are provided by wool in a physiological sense, how might that extend into the cognitive realm and the emotional realm as well? It's essentially translating whether those physiological benefits for wool result in improved cognition and maybe even emotional benefits. And I can't help but think about crafting activities. If you're hand knitting and you've got some lovely wool that you're intimately involved with producing a product out of, how might that be better for you emotionally and so on compared to working with some acrylic or some synthetic material like that? So it's digging into these areas a little bit more, and in the same way that you can bring a scientific lens to something like washing frequency or so on, looking into these aspects as well. A couple of notes of caution, though, before I finish. The first one is a concern about new applications for wool that require the wool to be low cost. Just because you can make a product successfully and commercially viably with the wool price at $3 a kilo or whatever it might be, we don't want that to be the long-term scenario for wool. So I think it's important to think about novel applications for wool that can sustain the wool price being double that. Treble that. And I put cardboard boxes there because packaging is one of these examples that comes up from time to time as a potential application for wool to be used for, but it's inherently, other than very specialized forms, it's inherently very low value. So, you might be able to get some cheap wool and make some cost-effective packaging at the moment, but in 5 years' time, when it's $9 a kilo for strong wool, that's not gonna cut the mustard. And there's other applications like maybe soil conditioners and things like that would use wool. There's probably there are ways to use some of those waste keratin streams where we could look at those lower value applications perhaps, but not the ones that need wool. And I think the other thing that we always grapple with in this space as well is how to generate volume from these higher value new applications for wool. That's the other way that we need to try and build demand is by consuming and demanding more wool for these application areas. And of course, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do high value, low volume applications. It just means that we need to encourage more of those. So we've got lots of low volume applications that add up to a high volume one, but hopefully also having some that are kind of in that medium value space but are higher volume and can really get some traction on the wool price as well. Because ultimately we do need farmers to get a good return for their wool, or for there to be a wool industry, because there will be a tipping point at some stage at which is just there is nothing, and then it doesn't matter how cool our new application is for wool, there isn't any wool to make it out of. So finally, Wool Reimagined was the name of the presentation. So in my mind, I'm reimagining it as an advanced material, both in its fiber form, but also as an ingredient to put into other things, as something to be reconstituted into new materials, to be used in applications where its inherent strengths and benefits are amplified and exploited, so not putting it into places where it doesn't offer any particular benefit. But also, I guess, acknowledging that as we move in this path towards new application areas, there's an opportunity to influence how the wool is produced on the farm and how that specification might change over time from where it has historically been oriented towards applications like carpets and interior textiles, and more towards applications like new materials or filters or hygiene products, or whatever else it might be. And having that influence over how the wool is produced and prepared, getting people, as John said, getting farmers to take more care with the fiber as well. It's not just about what they grow, but also what they do with it. Because I think these things become more important when you are putting it into high value applications. I mean, we've ended up in a low value space at the moment, which means it's hard to justify doing more than the bare minimum with it, or changing what you grow a lot of the time. So with that, I shall finish. That's my vision for Wool Reimagined. This was the response, the illustration there is a response to my request of an AI to tell me what a sheep would think of as Wool Reimagined. It decided it was something to do with more sheep, which I guess is a good place where we want to be as well, more sheep and more wool, but more dollars for it as well. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Wonderful exploration. Managed to take us all the way through the innovations that have occurred. I recognize it's a potted history, and you've teased it apart. Questions for John? Or for Stewart, sorry, John.
And John.
Yeah.
The life cycle assessment has compared significantly.
Yeah. So the question is about.
That much for this
Yes. It does seem to, I believe. One of the deficiencies of life cycle assessments for wool is that they use a lot of historical information that was out of date, so they have been updated, but and you can always argue about what should be included on the synthetic fiber side as well. They get a free ride and start production as you just dig it out of the ground and you've got it. And yeah, as soon as you exclude all of the end of life concerns that there might be, but on that basic production LCA, my understanding is that wool does come out with a disadvantage there. Yeah.
So I assume other countries are doing similar development. How far ahead of New Zealand about these products and services?
That's a good question. There are enthusiastic entrepreneurial people doing things with wool all over the world. I think that maybe New Zealand is unique in having such a focus on trying to develop new uses for strong wool in particular, and going as far as treating it as something to make new materials out of. So yeah, not totally. I wouldn't claim to have a complete understanding of what's happening in other parts of the world, but I think that, and I guess the other thing is that in say Australia, because the dominance of merino production there, the merino situation is different to strong wool, definitely. And I think the focus there has been much more on building the story and demand for merino in traditional applications, although they're perhaps slightly less traditional because it's moving into, away from fine worsted suits and into sportswear and leisure wear and things like that. And I didn't mention it in the presentation, but the study about laundering frequency and odor development is research that was funded by Australian Wool Innovation. And the biodegradation studies that I talked about was funded by Australian Wool Innovation as well. Both of those have that focus on apparel uses, machine washable wool and clothing. So I think I think New Zealand might be close to unique in having such a focus on trying to develop new uses for strong wool. Yeah, so yes, it's always a good question. It depends on the volatile. The ones that have been most studied in terms of indoor air quality are formaldehyde and nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide. Formaldehyde reacts with wool, so it's there in the wool forever. It's not formaldehyde anymore. It's now part of the wool. Those oxides have a very strong affinity for the functional groups in the fiber and are not easily released. It can be driven out, I think, by heating. They might be revolatilized in that way. The other volatiles that are important are all the odor-causing ones, which it's a similar story. It depends on exactly what the volatile is. But the great thing about wool is it's got such a diversity of functional groups in its chemistry that it can have a strong affinity for lots of different types of volatiles. And in fact, the main reason that wool is low odor, one of the main reasons, is that it has a low re-emission of those volatiles. So something like polyester will actually absorb quite a lot of volatile onto the surface of the fiber, but it comes off again. So yes, it depends, but they're very securely bound. You could probably dislodge some of them by wet cleaning as well, but then that would push them out into the water that you were cleaning it with, and then that would go away. You would essentially recharge the wool, but you can do it again. Circumstances. Yes. I think that's a good question to think about, and I can't answer it. It's definitely outside my experience. So that's but it might be right. It might be a very precisely engineered fiber that we want for advanced application. Yeah. I imagine the sort of equivalents of greenhouses with essentially wool carpets just growing. You run over it with a lawnmower to harvest it.
All right, questions? Sorry. I suspect the answers. But what I'm trying to say is a person needed behind you, Alison. Do you know anyone doing anything in analysis of production? Except things like that. Yeah. So Chair, there you are. Yes, Chair. Chris, very fun. How's it been?
An opportunity, right? And as Stewart indicated, the opportunity for a circular income, and to get credit partnerships is absolutely critical. Instead of looking at single products, we actually have to look at the supply chain, and some of those low value would be at the end of that circularity.
Yes.
Join me in thanking both speakers tonight. I'm sure that there's plenty of questions that you'd like to ask them, but we also know we need to wet their whistle. So thank you very much.
I just do a quick advertisement for this coming weekend, Rural Delivery, which is at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. Oh, come around 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, 6 o'clock on Sunday, 8 o'clock Saturday, 6 o'clock Sunday. TV1, Thomas Sullivan will have a section there on the flock panels. We've got these panels here at Lincoln. I'm not saying they can contact agents, we could probably show you where they are. I don't know if they're flock panels going. But no, yeah, it's yeah. That's probably but Vortex are doing panel too, but just that would be worth looking at. Tom's a real enthusiast, you know, get these classrooms that are not favourable in New Zealand, but we plan hellishly noisy. Might suppress some and what's very interesting. So,
Thank you again for joining us tonight. These are wonderful sessions. They showcase both the talent in the university, but also the talent in Lincoln. So welcome, enjoy drinks, enjoy the food.